On the morning of July 27, 1998, Cynthia Campbell, a 41-year-old attorney in East Milton, Florida, was reported missing. Her absence was uncharacteristic. She was known for her punctuality and reliability. The previous morning, Campbell had experienced a strange incident. A lug nut was thrown through her window. This event prompted her to call the police, and during the investigation, she was seen conversing with her neighbor, Norman Grimm, Jr. Later that day, Campbell failed to attend scheduled meetings with her bookkeeper and secretary. Concerned, her colleagues went to her home, finding the front door ajar, lights on, and her car parked outside. Despite searching the premises, Campbell was nowhere to be found. Neighbors and police began to search the area, but there was no sign of her. The case quickly escalated from a missing person report to a suspected crime. Cynthia Campbell was more than just a victim. She was a dedicated attorney, a professional who built a reputation not only for her legal expertise, but for her unwavering commitment to justice. At 41 years old, Cynthia had carved a successful career for herself, establishing a law practice in the small, tight-knit community of East Milton, Florida. Her life, though centered around her work, was not defined solely by her career. Those who knew Cynthia described her as meticulous, reliable, and deeply passionate about her cases. She wasn't just an attorney. She was a trusted advisor and a friend to many. Colleagues often spoke of her ability to blend empathy with her professional acumen, creating a balanced dynamic in the courtroom. Outside of her work, Cynthia had a quieter, private life. She was a regular at local cafes and enjoyed spending time with a close-knit group of friends. Her love for books, particularly legal thrillers, was well known, as was her penchant for late-night reading sessions. She had a passion for law, but she also nurtured a love for travel and nature, often taking solitary walks in the quiet hours of the morning to clear her mind. However, like many professionals, Cynthia had made enemies along the way. As a lawyer, her role often placed her in adversarial situations, but she had built her career by handling even the most contentious cases with professionalism and respect. Despite these challenges, no one anticipated that her life would end untimely in such an unexpected way. What made Cynthia particularly memorable to those who knew her was her reliability and her consistent presence in her community. She had a way of quietly commanding respect without seeking it, earning admiration from her peers and the trust of her clients. Cynthia's absence was immediately noticed by the people around her, not just because she was missing, but because her disappearance felt out of character. Her life, marked by discipline and integrity, was tragically interrupted by a series of events that would ultimately lead to her untimely passing. But to those who knew her, Cynthia was much more than just a case file or a news headline. She was a woman with aspirations, dreams, and relationships that had been abruptly severed, leaving behind a void that no one could have anticipated. Connie Kelly, Campbell's bookkeeper, arrived at Campbell's house at 7:20 a.m., entered the house, called Campbell's name, but did not receive an answer. Kelly became concerned and called the police. Cynthia McGee, Campbell's paralegal, went to Campbell's house later in the morning, saw her car parked in front of the house, and went inside to check. Deputy Sheriffs Calvin Rutherford and Stephen McCauley arrived 10 to 15 minutes after McGee. Rutherford obtained permission from Norman Grimm to look inside his home and noted that Grimm had no shirt on and that there was a light pink color on one of his shoulders. Neither deputy saw any signs that there had been a struggle in the house. Corporal Blevin Davis arrived at 11 a.m. and talked briefly with Norman Grimm. Davis observed that Grimm was wearing a pair of cut-off blue jean shorts with several small reddish-brown stains on them. There was another reddish-brown stain on his shoulder. Grimm explained that the stains were primer paint from where he had been working on his car. Grimm asked for and obtained permission to get his dogs that were now loose in the neighborhood. The officers tried to follow Grimm and his dogs, but they quickly vanished. Meanwhile, as police scoured the area for clues, a witness came forward. A local fisherman who was out near the Pensacola Bay fishing bridge had seen Grimm's car parked near the bridge, the trunk open. The fisherman had no way of knowing at the time, but it would turn out that Grimm had abandoned his car there, with evidence soon to be discovered in its trunk that would link him directly to the crime. By the time the authorities had pieced these details together, it was clear that they were dealing with a man who had no intention of letting himself be caught easily. The initial stages of the investigation pointed toward a challenging case, but the clues would soon fall into place. This investigation is about to take a shocking turn. As the investigation into Cynthia Campbell's disappearance deepened, the evidence began to point more clearly toward one person, her neighbor, Norman Grimm Jr. The critical moment came when Grimm's car was located near the Pensacola Bay fishing bridge. The trunk of his vehicle, which had been unusually secured at the time of the search, was found open, and inside, investigators discovered crucial evidence that would change the entire direction of the case. The remains were later identified as belonging to Cynthia Campbell, and investigators immediately recognized this was not a random occurrence. The evidence suggested a calculated attempt to conceal what had happened. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was methodical and planned. Forensic investigators quickly went to work, gathering physical evidence from the scene and Grimm's property. Inside Grimm's home, police found matching materials, identical to those recovered during the investigation, and the same kind of rope, tape, and plastic bags. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. But what about the motive? Investigators knew that Grimm had a history of threatening behavior. He had served time in prison for robbery, armed burglary, kidnapping, and battery. But what was the trigger for this particular crime? Did it stem from a personal dispute, or was it part of a pattern of escalating conduct? Further analysis of Grimm's past revealed a deeper, more troubling story. He had a history of criminal offenses, including a series that spanned decades. His actions toward Cynthia Campbell seemed to reflect an underlying pattern, a man who had no qualms about using force to solve problems. But the lack of a clear personal motive made the crime even more puzzling. Why would Grimm harm a neighbor who had not been a direct threat to him? Theories emerged that suggested Grimm might have harbored some resentment toward Cynthia. He had been a frequent presence in her life, and their interactions had become increasingly strange. Was it possible that something had triggered an outburst? Was it the result of long-standing animosity? Or had Grimm simply snapped, acting on a deeper psychological issue? These questions remained central to the investigation as detectives tried to piece together a motive. The breakthrough came when the coroner's report was completed. Cynthia Campbell had sustained serious injuries. The coroner's report revealed what had occurred. There were also signs of a struggle. The deliberate nature of what happened indicated that it was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated act that reflected a calculated intent. As investigators continued to uncover the evidence, they also focused on Grimm's actions after the crime. He had fled the area, attempting to evade capture. The police later learned that Grimm had been on the run for several days before being apprehended in Watonga, Oklahoma, near his father's home. His capture would mark the beginning of the legal process that would bring him to trial. As the investigation progressed, the case against Norman Grimm Jr. continued to build steadily, supported by both physical evidence and the mounting profile of the suspect. The discovery of Cynthia Campbell's remains, the damning forensic findings, and Grimm's increasingly suspicious behavior all pointed toward his guilt. However, the case took on a new dimension as it progressed through the legal system, facing complications and unexpected twists that would test the effectiveness of the investigation. The authorities' initial efforts to capture Grimm were focused on his flight from the area after the crime. His attempt to disappear was a key factor in delaying his capture, but the investigation moved forward on multiple fronts. Witnesses who had seen Grimm's car near the Pensacola Bay fishing bridge provided further clarity on his movements. These sightings, combined with the evidence found in his vehicle, linked Grimm directly to the crime. Yet, the investigation was far from over. The question of motive remained unresolved for a time. While Grimm had been a suspect from the outset, the police were still working to understand why he would harm Cynthia Campbell, a woman he had known as a neighbor. His behavior after the crime was peculiar, but authorities could not easily pinpoint a clear trigger. No prior disputes or obvious conflicts had been reported between the two. In fact, many saw their relationship as largely neutral, with minimal interaction beyond the occasional pleasantries exchanged between neighbors. As the case developed, the authorities began to focus more on Grimm's history, and it was here that the key to the mystery began to take shape. His past and history of criminal behavior offered insights into his psychological profile. Norman Grimm had a history of engaging in criminal acts. He had been convicted of robbery, armed burglary, and kidnapping, among other offenses. He had served multiple prison sentences, and by the time he harmed Cynthia, he was still on parole for a robbery conviction in Texas. This long history suggested that Grimm had a pattern of behavior that involved the misuse of power and control over others. His actions toward Cynthia may not have been based on any personal conflict with her, but rather a deeper, more troubling compulsion. Some investigators began to believe that Grimm's threatening tendencies had simply escalated, and Cynthia, a woman he had access to as a neighbor, became the victim of his behavior. As the case moved through the courts, it became clear that Grimm's defense team would try to argue that Cynthia's passing had been caused by one of her many enemies. She was a lawyer, after all, and had likely made adversaries over the course of her career. This theory was presented to the jury as an alternative explanation for what happened. However, this line of defense was ultimately unsuccessful. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming, and the jury quickly rejected the notion that someone else could have been responsible. A key moment in the trial came when the defense attempted to discredit the evidence. They questioned the forensic findings, suggesting that certain evidence found in Grimm's home could have been placed there intentionally. However, the forensic experts presented a strong case, demonstrating that the physical evidence was consistent with the type of injuries Cynthia had sustained. Moreover, the matching materials found at both locations, ropes, tape, and other items, were too specific to be dismissed as coincidence. The trial also revealed startling details about Grimm's mindset. During the penalty phase, it was disclosed that Grimm had expressed a wish for the ultimate outcome. He made it clear that he would rather face the most severe consequences than spend his life in prison. This attitude, coupled with his history, painted a troubling portrait of a man who had reached the end of a long, destructive path. Grimm's refusal to allow his defense attorneys to present mitigating evidence about his upbringing and mental health further solidified the prosecution's case. His insistence on facing the consequences without the benefit of a defense painted him as someone who had resigned himself to his fate. Despite these complexities, the jury convicted Grimm of first-degree charges, and the case moved towards sentencing. What you're about to hear is serious. If you think more people need to know about cases like this, where justice takes decades, share this video right now. Your share could help this story reach someone who needs to hear it. As his fate was sealed, the public was left to grapple with the reality of the crime and the man behind it. The resolution of the case against Norman Grimm Jr. was marked by a conviction that solidified the overwhelming evidence against him. In December 2000, Grimm was sentenced to capital punishment for taking Cynthia Campbell's life. The courtroom echoed with the finality of the verdict, yet for many, it also marked the beginning of a lengthy legal process that would play out over the next several years. Grimm's trial had been a grueling affair, with the prosecution presenting a mountain of evidence that tied him directly to the crime. His history, the forensic evidence, and his own actions before and after the crime left little doubt about his guilt. Despite this, his defense team pursued multiple avenues of appeal, challenging both the conviction and the sentence. However, each of these appeals was ultimately denied, with courts reaffirming the strength of the case against him. Grimm's refusal to allow his attorneys to present mitigating evidence during his penalty phase raised troubling questions about his mental state. His quick acceptance to fate and his rejection of any efforts to save his life painted a picture of a man who had long abandoned any hope for redemption or rehabilitation. He had spent years in prison, with a criminal history that spanned decades, and his life in the outside world seemed to have deteriorated into hostility and resentment. For years after his conviction, Grimm remained incarcerated under the most severe sentence, his case becoming an example of the psychological toll that criminal behavior can have on a person. He would become one of many individuals serving lengthy sentences for serious crimes, their circumstances determined by the severity of their actions, and the judicial system designed to hold them accountable. But in Grimm's case, the resolution came with more than just a verdict. It also revealed the larger, uncomfortable truths about justice, consequences, and the human condition. As time went on, Grimm's fate was cemented with a finality that many saw as inevitable. The legal battles continued, but Grimm's path toward his ultimate sentence seemed to be the only thing that remained certain. The public, meanwhile, could not forget the tragedy that had unfolded. Cynthia Campbell's passing left a void in her community, and her absence was felt by the colleagues, friends, and family who had known her well. Grimm's sentence was scheduled to be carried out on October 28, 2025, after years of appeals and prolonged legal procedures. As the date approached, the case served as a stark reminder of the complexities of the justice system and the far-reaching consequences of serious crime. Grimm, a man who had committed such an act, was now facing the consequences of his own actions. The legal legal and moral questions surrounding capital punishment remain unresolved in many ways. While some viewed the outcome as just, others questioned the ethics of such sentences, especially in a case that was as psychologically complex as this one. The long delays in carrying out such sentences, as well as the emotional toll it takes on the families of the victims, contributed to the ongoing debate over the effectiveness and morality of this form of punishment. As of now, the case of Norman Grimm Jr. remains a closed chapter in the story of Cynthia Campbell's life, but it continues to raise significant questions about crime, punishment, and the human capacity for harmful behavior. The legal system has played out its course, but for many, the case remains a poignant reminder of the troubling realities that can exist within individuals and the sometimes complex and painful journey toward justice. Cynthia Campbell's loss and the subsequent trial of Norman Grimm Jr. left deep emotional scars on the community of East Milton, Florida, and raised troubling questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the human cost of serious crime. Though Grimm's conviction and scheduled execution provided a form of closure, the ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. For Cynthia's colleagues, friends, and family, the loss was not just personal, it was a collective wound. Cynthia had been a respected attorney, known for her professionalism, compassion, and integrity. Her passing was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of even the most well-established individuals in society. In a small community like East Milton, where everyone knew everyone else, the severity of what happened seemed almost incomprehensible. Her absence left a void that would be felt for years to come. The case also highlighted the complexities of the criminal justice system. Norman Grimm Jr., with his extensive criminal history and expressed acceptance to fate, became an example of a man who seemed beyond rehabilitation. His case raised the age-old questions about the purpose of capital punishment, whether it serves as justice, deterrence, or retribution. Grimm's lawyers worked tirelessly to delay the carrying out of his sentence, citing various legal and procedural issues, yet Grimm himself seemed to reject the idea of salvation. His decision not to present mitigating evidence at his trial, his refusal to fight for his life, and his repeated expressions of willingness to die suggested a man who had long since abandoned any hope of redemption. The controversy surrounding such sentences persisted long after Grimm's conviction. For those who opposed capital punishment, the case was a tragic illustration of the emotional and moral complexity that surrounds such final judgments. Grimm had spent years under this sentence, during which time his case was subject to multiple appeals, further extending the emotional toll on everyone involved. Some felt that the long delay between his conviction and the carrying out of his sentence, often seen as a failure of the system, left everyone involved trapped in a cycle of uncertainty. For others, the final outcome represented the inevitable consequence of his actions. His history, the severity of his crime, and his indifference to the legal process seemed to leave little room for sympathy. The case became an example of the failure of an individual to confront his past and his capacity for harm. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming evidence, some questions remained unanswered. Was Grimm truly beyond rehabilitation? And, given the complexities of his psychological profile, was capital punishment the most just response to his crime? Reflecting on Cynthia Campbell's life and loss also brought attention to the often overlooked impact on those who are left behind. The loss of a loved one to such circumstances is not just an emotional wound, but a life-altering event that reverberates across relationships, careers, and entire communities. The families and friends who knew Cynthia Campbell were left to pick up the pieces, their grief compounded by the tragic circumstances surrounding what happened. The crime also had a profound impact on the legal community, where the loss of one of their own served as a grim reminder of the risks lawyers face, even in small, close-knit communities. As Norman Grimm Jr. prepared to face his sentence being carried out, the case remained a significant chapter in the larger conversation about justice and punishment. It underscored the importance of understanding the root causes of criminal behavior and the complexities of such conduct. It also served as a cautionary tale about the limits of the justice system when it comes to dealing with individuals who, like Grimm, are determined to resist any chance at redemption. The legacy of this case lies not in the finality of the outcome, but in the deeper questions it raised about society's response to serious crime, the ethics of capital punishment, and the long-lasting emotional effects on communities. While the legal system has brought closure to Cynthia Campbell's case, the emotional and societal ramifications will echo long into the future. This case forces us to ask difficult questions about justice, redemption, and ultimate sentences. What's your take? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more in-depth examinations of cases that make us question everything, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.